They found him wearing 3 layers of clothes belonging to a dead man. While his friend starved to death beside him, he was strangely warm and well fed. The ice hides the truth about what he ate to survive the white hell. The ice did not crack. It waited. It was a floor of granite, hidden under a dusting of deceptively soft powder. Then Betrayal, the sky fell. There was no warning siren, only the sudden, sickening lurch of the silver Leviathan losing its war against gravity. The rear engine nacelle struck first, disintegrating into a spray of metal and fuel. Then the control cabin slammed into the pack, with the violence of a sledgehammer hitting glass. The impact sheared the aluminum spine. The cabin, the heavy heart of the airship, was ripped clean off the belly of the beast. 9 men and 1 terrier were vomited onto the frozen jagged teeth of the Arctic. They tumbled across the pressure ridges, limbs flailing, bones snapping like dry twigs. The general hit the ground with a wet thud, his leg folding at an angle nature never intended. Pain was a later problem. Now, there was only the physics of a nightmare. Relieved of the weight of the command gondola, the great hydrogen envelope did not fall. It sprang upward. It was a predator released from a trap. The silver balloon rocketed back into the freezing fog, lighter, faster, unreachable. But it was not empty. Inside the keel, deep in the belly of the rising ghost, 6 mechanics were still at their posts. Those on the broken ice looked up through eyes crusted with instant frost. They saw the faces of their friends peering down from the catwalk. They saw mouths open in screams that the wind instantly swallowed. The ship became a dot. The dot became a ghost. Then the white fog ate them whole. They were gone. Not dead. Just gone. Taken by the sky. On the ice. The silence rushed back in to fill the hole the engines had left. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. The wind hissed over the razors of ice. A man groaned, clutching a chest that no longer rose evenly. Another crawled on hands and knees, leaving a trail of bright arterial red that steamed in the sub-zero air. The radio lay on its side, a useless box of wires singing static. They were dots of imperfection on a pristine white sheet. At the top of the world, they were alive. But as the general looked at the empty gray sky, where his ship had vanished, he realized that living was the cruelest punishment the Arctic could offer. The dying had been the easy part. The freezing had just begun. To understand the cruelty of the crash, one must first understand the height of the triumph. Only 48 hours before the ice shattered their bones, these men were gods. They floated above the top of the world in a silver palace, suspended by hydrogen and ambition. General Nobile stood at the window of the gondola, a man who believed he had tamed the sky. Below them lay the North Pole, a mathematical abstraction made of frozen ocean, an endless white silence. They opened the hatch and dropped the heavy wooden cross blessed by the Pope. They dropped the Italian flag. It was a ceremony of possession. They watched the colors flutter down and settle on the featureless expanse. In that moment, they believed they had conquered the wilderness. They toasted with champagne. They sent radio messages of victory to Rome. But the Arctic is not a territory to be claimed. It is a sleeping beast, and their celebration had just woken it up. The turn back toward civilization was where the trap sprung. The wind, previously a servant, became a wall of invisible concrete. The airship, named Italia, battered against a headwind that did not want to let them leave. The speed of the ship dropped to nearly zero. They were burning fuel just to stand still. Then came the fog. It was not a soft mist. It was a freezing blindness that coated every inch of the metal frame in heavy, wet rime. The ship began to eat itself. Ice formed on the spinning propeller blades, building up until centrifugal force tore chunks of hard ice loose. These shards were flung outward like shrapnel, slashing through the delicate fabric of the hydrogen envelope. The ship was bleeding gas. The crew scrambled along the keel, patching the bullet holes with desperate, freezing fingers, but the cold was relentless. The silver skin of the dirigible grew heavy. Tons of ice accumulated on the nose, dragging it down like a stone tied to a swimmer. Then came the fatal mechanical stroke. The elevator helm, the heavy wheel that controlled their altitude, locked tight. The freezing dampness had seized the gears. The pilot wrestled with the wheel, sweat freezing on his forehead, but the metal was fused. The ship was no longer a flying machine. It was a falling object. The nose dipped. The horizon tilted violently. No belay shouted orders, but physics had stopped listening to him. They dropped from the clouds toward the unforgiving pack ice. The altimeter needle spun counterclockwise, 3,000 feet, 2,000, 1,000. The fog cleared just enough to show them what was coming. The jagged teeth of the earth were rising to meet them. The engines screamed in reverse, a futile attempt to break against gravity. It was too late. The pride of the nation was seconds away from becoming a smear of wreckage. The golden hour was over. The time of the wolf had begun. The silence that followed the crash was heavier than the scream of the engines. It was a physical weight pressing down on the chest. The survivors lay scattered on the ice, like toys thrown by a petulant child. When the adrenaline faded, the pain arrived. It came in waves. General Nobile tried to stand, but his body refused the command. His leg was shattered, the bone grinding against itself with every shift of weight. His arm hung uselessly at his side. He was the commander of an expedition that no longer existed, a general without an army, trapped in a kingdom of ice that recognized no rank. They gathered the wreckage. It was a pitiful harvest. A few tins of pemmican, packs of chocolate, a sleeping bag, and the radio. The field radio, the Ondina 33, was a small wooden box of wires and vacuum tubes. It looked fragile, almost insulting in its inadequacy against the sheer scale of the Arctic isolation. B.A.G., the radio man, cradled it like a newborn child. He cleaned the snow from its dials with trembling fingers. If this box was dead, they were all dead. They just had not stopped breathing yet. The sun did not set. It circled the horizon, a pale, unblinking eye that offered no warmth. The light was flat and gray, erasing shadows and depth perception, making holes in the ice look like solid ground. To survive, they needed shelter. To be found, they needed to be seen. But their small silk tent was beige. It was the color of dirty snow. From the air, it would be invisible, lost in the endless white texture of the pack ice. They were ghosts wrapped in camouflage. Then they remembered the aniline bombs. These were glass spheres filled with potent red dye, intended to mark altitude on the white snow below during the flight. Now, they were paint. They were the only color in a world of monochrome. The men took the glass spheres and smashed them. The liquid inside was thick and violent. It spilled out onto the snow, staining the pristine white with a shocking, artificial crimson. It looked like a massacre. It looked like the ice was bleeding. With desperate, frozen hands, they began to smear the dye onto the silk walls of their shelter. They did not have brushes. They used rags and their own palms. The process was gruesome to watch. As they worked, the dye stained their gloves and their skin. In the dim light, it looked exactly like fresh arterial blood. They looked less like explorers and more like butchers working in a slaughterhouse. They painted stripes and patches, trying to make the tent scream out against the indifference of the landscape. The dye did not take evenly. It dried in jagged, ugly streaks. When they finished, they stepped back to look at their creation. It stood out against the blue twilight with a vibrating intensity. It was no longer a shelter. It was a wound, a festering red gash on the skin of the world. The red tent was born. It was a beacon of hope, but it was also a tombstone marker, waiting for names to be carved into the ice. Inside, the air was still freezing, but outside, the red silk flapped in the wind, a frantic heartbeat in the dead chest of the north. The first blood had been drawn, not by a bear, but by their own hands, in a desperate bid to be remembered by the living world. The world had shrunk to the size of a wooden box. Inside the red tent, the universe was composed of shivering men, the smell of unwashed bodies, and the rhythmic, metallic clicking of the telegraph key. Radio Man Biaggi sat hunched over the Ondina 33, a priest praying to an indifferent god. His fingers were wrapped in rags, the tips numb and clumsy, yet he maintained the rhythm, SOS, Italia, Nobile. The dots and dashes flew out from the antenna, piercing the Arctic fog, traveling at the speed of light toward civilization. But the only answer was static. The speakers hissed like a nest of snakes. For days, they tapped out their existence, screaming electronically into the void, and the void refused to scream back. They were ghosts haunting a frequency that no one was listening to. Despair is a rot, and it spreads faster in close quarters. The group began to fracture. The passive waiting became a form of torture. 3 men decided they could no longer sit and wait for a rescue that might never come. Finn Malmgren, the Swedish meteorologist, looked at the horizon with eyes that were already beginning to glaze over. He knew the ice better than anyone. He knew the odds. Yet, he stood up. Alongside him stood Zappi and Mariano, 2 Italian officers who preferred the gamble of movement to the certainty of starvation. They packed what little food they could spare. They took the best boots. They said their goodbyes to the general, who lay broken on his stretcher, a king watching his court dissolve. The 3 walkers stepped out of the red tent and into the white labyrinth. The separation was immediate. The tent, that small crimson wound on the snow, vanished behind a ridge of pressure ice within minutes. Now, there was only the wind and the crunch of boots on the crust. They marched south, aiming for the solid ground of Svalbard. But the Arctic had a cruel joke in reserve. The ice pack was not stationary. It was a massive, drifting continent floating on the Black Ocean. A powerful current was pushing the entire ice sheet north, away from land, faster than the men could walk south. They were trapped on a demonic treadmill. They walked for 10 hours, legs burning, lungs searing with the cold, only to check their position and realize they were farther from land than when they started. The physical decay set in with terrifying speed. The human body is a furnace that needs fuel, and they were running on empty. The cold began to shut down the extremities to save the core. Toes turned waxy and pale, then mottled blue, and finally the dead, charcoal black of gangrene. But the eyes went first. The glare of the sun on the endless snow burned their retinas. It started as a grit, a feeling of sand under the eyelids. Then came the weeping pus. Then the blindness. Malmgren, the guide, the one who knew the way, was failing. He stumbled over ice blocks he could not see. He fell into pools of slush that soaked his boots, turning his feet into blocks of ice. The pain was not sharp. It was a dull, consuming throb that ate away at the will to live. They were 3 specks of dying heat in a universe of absolute zero, crawling across a shifting puzzle that was actively trying to drown them. The silence of the ice was broken only by their ragged breathing and the sound of a man falling, getting up, and falling again. The ice had finally claimed Finn Malmgren. He did not die in a moment, but by inches. He was a statue of frost and pain. His left arm frozen in a bent angle. His legs useless pillars of dead meat. He lay in a shallow trench that Zappi and Mariano had scooped out of the hard snow with their bare hands. It was not a grave. It was a waiting room for death. Malmgren looked up at the 2 Italians standing over him. His eyes were milky with blindness, but his voice was clear. He told them to go. He told them he was the anchor dragging them to the bottom of the white ocean. He gave them his compass. He gave them the last of his strength. Zappi and Mariano looked at the man who had guided them. Then they looked at the southern horizon. Survival is a cold equation. They turned their backs. They walked away. They left him living in a hole in the ice, waiting for the cold to stop his heart. Miles away, at the red tent, the sky offered a different kind of cruelty. It offered hope. A sound broke the monotony of the wind. It was not the crack of a glacier, but the rhythmic, mechanical hum of an engine. The survivors dragged themselves out of the tent. They waved their arms. They screamed at the clouds. A small biplane, a Fokker with skis instead of wheels, dropped out of the gray ceiling. It circled once, a buzzing insect against the vast desolation, and then touched down. The skis slapped the uneven ice, bouncing and sliding to a halt in a spray of powder. The pilot was a Swede named Einar Lundborg. He climbed out of the cockpit, a creature from another world, smelling of oil and warm leather. The survivors crowded around him, their faces black with grime and frostbite, their eyes wild with hunger. They expected evacuation. They expected a shuttle service to freedom. But Lundborg shook his head. He had not come for the mechanics. He had not come for the radio man. He pointed a gloved finger at the general. "I can take one man," the pilot said, "and it must be the general." Nobile protested. The code of the sea and the code of the air is written in stone. The captain goes last. The leader stands on the burning deck until the crew is safe. But Lundborg was adamant. He argued that he needed the general to coordinate the rescue from the base ship. He argued that Nobile was small, light, and injured. He argued that the heavy mechanics would make the plane too heavy to take off from the rough ice. It was a negotiation for a soul. The wind howled around them, drowning out the whispers of conscience. The decision was made in seconds. But it would weigh on history for a century. The general allowed himself to be lifted. He was placed into the rear cockpit. He held his small fox terrier, Titi-na, against his chest. The dog was safe. The general was safe. The mechanics stood back. They watched their commander, the man who had led them into this hell, strap himself into the seat of salvation. The propeller spun, the engine roared, kicking up a blinding cloud of snow. The plane lurched forward, gaining speed, bouncing over the ridges, and then, miraculously, it lifted. It climbed into the gray sky, banking south. The men on the ice stood in silence. They were smaller now. The red tent seemed more fragile. The silence that returned was heavier than before, because now it contained the taste of betrayal. They were alone. The radio was silent. The food was gone. And their leader was a disappearing dot in the clouds, flying toward warm blankets and hot soup, while they remained to rot in the kingdom of the polar bear. The pact of brotherhood was broken. The real winter had just arrived. The rescue did not arrive on the wings of an angel, but in the belly of a beast. The Soviet icebreaker Krassin was a black Leviathan of riveted steel, vomiting coal smoke into the pristine sky. It did not navigate the ice. It murdered it. The prow rose up and smashed down, crushing the frozen pack with the sound of artillery fire. On the 12th of July, the lookout in the crow's nest saw something that did not belong. It was not a seal. It was a man. They found Zappi and Mariano on a small, disintegrating floe. The scene was a tableau of horror that would haunt the rescuers for the rest of their lives. Zappi stood tall. He waved his arms with a vigor that seemed impossible for a man who had walked on the ocean for weeks. He was frantic, energetic, almost manic. Beside him, half submerged in a pool of freezing slush, lay Mariano. He was no longer a soldier. He was a pile of wet rags and bones. He did not wave. He only stared with eyes that had seen too much. As the sailors hauled them onto the deck, the disparity became grotesque. Mariano was naked, under his sodden rags. A skeleton wrapped in parchment skin, weighing less than a child. Zappi, however, was warm. He was wearing 3 sets of underwear. He was wearing 3 pairs of trousers. He was wearing the thick woolen socks that belonged to Finn Malmgren. He was wearing the dead man's parka. He was well fed. The question hung in the smoky air of the boiler room, unspoken, but deafening. Where was the meteorologist? And how had Zappi stayed so strong, while his companion withered away? The icebreaker crew looked at Zappi's full belly, and then at Mariano's starving frame, and they turned their faces away. The Arctic strips a man of his civilization, layer by layer, until only the animal remains. Later that day, the Krassin smashed its way to the red tent. The survivors there were pulled from their silk tomb. They were weeping, broken, but alive. The radio operator, B.A.G., clutched his wooden box. The nightmare on the ice was over. The world celebrated. Headlines screamed of the miracle. But the accounting was not finished. The ledger was still bleeding red. High above the celebration, the ghosts were still drifting. When the control cabin had ripped away weeks ago, the lighter envelope of the airship had shot upward, carrying 6 mechanics into the blind white fog. They had vanished without a trace. No radio message was ever received. No wreckage was ever spotted. No bodies were ever found. Did they drift for days? screaming at the empty horizon? Did they crash into the freezing ocean minutes later? Did they resort to the ultimate taboo before the end? The Arctic kept its secrets. The ice closed over their wake, sealing the evidence under 10 feet of frozen water. General Nobile lived, but he walked with the dead for the rest of his life. He was a man who had been saved first, a captain who abandoned his ship. The public tore him apart. The guilt was a colder prison than the red tent ever was. In the end, the rescue was not a triumph. It was a reprieve. The airship Italia became a myth, a ghost ship sailing the katabatic winds of the pole, crewed by 6 frozen men who looked down eternally at the world that forgot them. The ice does not forgive. The ice does not give back what it takes. It only waits for the next intruder to make a mistake.